Welcome to Native America Calling. I'm Sean Spruce. In the lead up to this year's UN Climate Summit in Brazil, the host country organized a series of meetings with indigenous peoples as a way to elevate their inclusion in the COP30 discussions. Still, thousands of indigenous attendees have little sway in the official proceedings. They instead organized marches and civil disobedience actions to protest a lack of progress on issues they say are most important. We'll get perspectives from participants at the summit. That's next after the news.
This is National Native News. I'm Brian Bull, sitting in for Antonia Gonzalez. For decades, starting in 1907, Indigenous women and women of color across the country were sterilized without their informed consent. Last week, a coalition of women's reproductive rights advocates called on New Mexico legislators to create a commission to investigate the abuses. KUNM's Jeanette DeDios has more.
Numerous reports show sterilizations peaked in the 1960s through the late 70s. That's when upwards of 70,000 Indigenous women were forced or coerced into sterilization procedures by the Indian Health Service and contracted physicians, including those at the University of New Mexico. By the mid-1970s, at least 25% of Indigenous women of childbearing age had been sterilized. Executive Director of Indigenous Women Rising, Rachel Lorenzo from the Mescalero Apache in Laguna Pueblo, says she was a target of coercion.
Doctors refused to take out my IUD, despite the fact the copper IUD, which is called Paragard, made me bleed for 10 months, and 4 different doctors refused to take it out because it was working the way it was supposed to. And they said I was too young at 22 to have another baby.
The proposed joint memorial would establish a memorial to victims, but also a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that would make New Mexico the first U.S. state to formally investigate and acknowledge the violations done to Indigenous women. Democratic State Senator Linda Lopez agreed that the legislature needs to acknowledge the role New Mexico played in this history.
It wasn't us who are here in the roundhouse at this point in time. And yes, it was maybe another governmental entity. But Madam Chair, I think those of us who are elected have a responsibility to say this should never have happened, this will not happen, and that we apologize.
Democratic State Representative Michelle Paulina Beta says there also needs to be more resources for educating youth about reproductive care. New Mexico currently doesn't have a law on forced sterilization. For National Native News, I'm Jeanette DeDios.
The Native Vote was center stage Tuesday morning at the National Congress of American Indians annual convention in Seattle. Panelists discuss various barriers facing Native voters and efforts to protect Native voting rights. Matthew Campbell, Deputy Director at the Native American Rights Fund, was on the panel. He says the states of the Native vote across the country has its ups and downs.
Typically, a voter might choose to only vote in the presidential election every 4 years. But I think it's really critical to remember that if we elect candidates of our choice in the state legislature, for the school boards, every single race really can make a difference in our lives. If we elect people that lift up and fight for tribal sovereignty at the state level, that's really important. And if we elect people that are aware about our culture and our tradition at the school board level, that's also really important.
Janie Parrish is the executive director of Arizona Native Vote. She says work on Native voting issues takes place year-round and not just during big election years like presidential or midterms.
Like many issues, whether it's tribal sovereignty, climate, education, there are people constantly working on these issues, whether that's on the advocacy side or lobbying or policy. It's the same thing with civic engagement and voting and elections.
Parrish is a panelist on civic engagement in Indian Country Wednesday afternoon. Voting is just one of the many issues attendees of the NCEI annual convention are focusing on. Organizers say this year's convention is seeing record numbers, with 2,500 people registered. This is National Native News. I'm Brian Bull in the KLCC studios of Eugene, Oregon.
National Native News is produced by Koahnic Broadcast Corporation with funding by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
The Indian Arts and Crafts Board promotes Indian artists of federally recognized tribes through its online source directory. Information on this no-charge opportunity available at doi.gov/IACB, who support this program. Support for law and justice-related programming provided by Hobbs, Stross, Dean & Walker, LLP, a national law firm dedicated to promoting and defending tribal rights for over 40 years. More information available at hobbsstrauss.com.
Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.
This is Native America Calling. I'm Sean Spruce. There were high hopes heading into this year's annual UN Climate Summit that Indigenous voices would be reflected in goals negotiated by world leaders toward a cooperative plan to address climate change. But many of the Indigenous people present at the gathering at the mouth of the Amazon River in Belém, Brazil, are sending the message that their concerns are being ignored. In record numbers, Indigenous people are protesting the proceedings at the summit. Today we'll talk with Indigenous climate advocates in Brazil about progress and concerns from this year's UN Climate Summit, also known as COP30. And later in the hour, we'll talk with Cree journalist Brandy Morin, who has spent almost a year in Ecuador reporting on Indigenous communities facing off against Canadian mining companies. Join us with a comment or question about global climate decisions. All you have to do is call 1-800-996-2848. That number is also 1-800-99-NATIVE. We have three guests joining us on Zoom from Belém, Brazil. First is Andrea Carmen. She is the executive director of the International Indian Treaty Council. She is Yaqui. Andrea, hello, and welcome back to Native America Calling.
Thank you very much for asking me again to be on the great Native American Calling. And it's very important, the issue that we're talking about today, as we all know, as Indigenous peoples, and in fact, our ancestors and our prophecies told us the critical situation, the life and death situation that we're facing. We don't talk about climate change, we talk about the climate crisis. And for myself, as an Indigenous Yaqui Nation member, we come from the desert, the Sonora Desert, which is in southern Arizona, United States, and northern Sonora, Mexico. And we, as well as Indigenous peoples around the world, are seeing the dire impacts already, and also working on solutions on the grassroots level. But here at the United Nations, we're also trying to impact the policies that the states are deciding. This is the United Nations. That means the states are the parties. That's what COP stands for, Conference of the Parties. And all legally binding UN conventions have Conference of the Parties, where the parties, the countries, get together and decide what they are going to do, what action they're going to take to address these concerns.
Well, let's talk about these concerns, Andrea, as you state them, COP, Conference of the Parties, because before leaving for Brazil, you said this meeting was set up to be the Indigenous Peoples Climate Summit. I want to know, is COP30 living up to that description?
Well, I never said that. This was what the Brazilian government was promoting. And one thing that they did, they brought at least 3,000 Indigenous peoples here, Indigenous representatives, many of whom, the vast majority from Brazil itself, from the Amazon, but only a few hundred of those Indigenous representatives were able to get credentials to actually get in the session to impact the discussions and the negotiations. We have the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change, which is the Indigenous Caucus, made up of several hundred representatives from all over the world. And we are working very hard here to impact critical issues impacting us, like just transition, where they're trying to pass off these what they call critical minerals or transition minerals like lithium that's threatening our nation just over the border in Mexico, and many other impacts that we're experiencing that aren't solutions at all. And we think that Indigenous peoples do have solutions in every way, from the policy level down to what we're doing on the grassroots level. But it's very difficult, even for those of us with credentials, to be inside. Right? The International Indian Treaty Council has been participating in these discussions for more than 2 decades.
Andrea,
And yes.
why is that? Why is it so hard for these Indigenous people to get inside the actual summit? And again, news is coming out that suggests many of these Indigenous people, they are frustrated that their concerns are not making it to the actual work of COP30.
Absolutely. They should be frustrated. And we've been in strong solidarity with the Indigenous peoples pushing their way to come in because they're desperate. Their lives are at stake. All of our lives are at stake. But here, because the conference is in Brazil, and the hopes were raised by the Brazilian government that this would be a place where their concerns and the issues that are impacting their way of life and survival would be heard. And then they find out not only can't they not be heard inside the negotiations, which is a struggle for those of us inside, but they can't even get in the building. So it's only natural that they're protesting. We're in strong solidarity with their issues. The Indigenous Caucus here has issued a statement of support. The International Indian Treaty Council issued a press release the day after the incident where the Indigenous peoples from Brazil pushed their way through UN security to try to get a voice. Of course they deserve a voice. We all do. We're on the front lines of this crisis. We're being impacted the most, and we've done the least to contribute to it. So the hopes that Indigenous peoples have, even being brought here and housed in a village, a few miles away from the venue, and not being able to get in at all to talk to the negotiators from the countries, is very frustrating. And we're desperate, faced by the situations that we're living through on the ground.
Andrea, you use the term climate crisis as opposed to climate change, and many of the Indigenous people at this conference, they are from Central and South America, and they are expressing frustrations about the impacts of how the climate is affecting their lives. They're witnessing it firsthand. That's a message that's shared by many Indigenous people, as you know, all over the world. What does it take to have that message reflected in policy and the climate goals of world leaders?
Well, we're still working very hard to push for a phase out of fossil fuel production, which is the primary driver of climate change. The states, I have to say, are not showing a lot of political will to put that on the front burner. And a lot of the solutions being pushed, whether it's mega dams or, like I said, lithium mining, or other forms of what's called critical minerals being carried out on our territories, with the same lack of free, prior, informed consent and respect for our rights that coal mining was or uranium mining was in the past. That's not a transition for us. So we have been able to get some wording protecting rights of Indigenous peoples into what is almost now the final decisions. The ministers are here and deciding on the final wording, but we really need for our rights to be respected here, our free, prior, informed consent, our land, our cultures, our ways of life, to be looked at as climate solutions, and not just in the way of more development and more economic gains in the name of now climate mitigation and just transition. And this is what we're seeing here. And it affects all of us, not just peoples here in the Amazon. The deforestation is continuing. They're telling us that despite the position that Brazil is putting for the world, that oil development is expanding in the Amazon. Illegal gold mining is allowed to continue. And we're facing these same conditions really literally all over the world. There's permits for lithium mining in the Black Hills of South Dakota. We're facing that in Arizona and Sonora, Mexico, and California and Nevada, you know, pushing through, fast tracking these projects that are not solutions to climate change, but that are also directly contaminating and using disproportionate levels of water in the desert areas and other places around the world where Indigenous peoples have safeguarded biodiversity, safeguarded our lands since time immemorial. And now, in the name of climate change, these actions are climate change solutions, supposedly. These actions are being carried out that are impacting us. But Indigenous peoples are bringing forth solutions, changing from industrial agriculture to sustainable agriculture using our methods, removing dams, which I think Thomas Joseph's going to talk about. But I think it's really important that you hear from Taylor and Edson as Indigenous representatives from nations and peoples here in Brazil, because I know Taylor has been in direct contact with the protesters and has carried that message inside the venue, not just to Indigenous peoples, but to the states, so they could understand why Indigenous peoples are protesting, why we're frustrated. So I want to thank you for the time and maybe turn it over to some of our other representatives that are on this call.
Well, we'll do that, Andrea, but first we need to take a break. And when we come back, I'm going to introduce our other guests who are joining us today to talk about COP30. And we've got the phone lines open for listeners who would like to join this conversation. COP30 stands for Conference of the Parties. It is an annual event hosted by the United Nations, a climate summit. It's been held in many locations across the planet. This year, it is in Brazil. If you'd like to talk, if you'd like to share a perspective or an insight with regard to COP30, or maybe just an environmental concern that is impacted or could be potentially discussed at COP30, give us a call. 1-800-996-2848. That number is also 1-800-99-NATIVE. We've got the phone lines open, so we'd like to hear from some listeners today. 1-800-99-NATIVE. The Nisqually tribe quickly shut down any talk of housing immigrant detainees in a tribal corrections facility. They say doing so would go against tribal values. And without the frantic work of her family members, a Native American woman was nearly handed over to immigration officials for deportation. We'll hear more about these events on the next Native America Calling.
The Association on American Indian Affairs invites all to Tribal Museums Day, December 6th through December 12th. Tribal museums may offer no-cost or reduced admission, art markets, and live cultural demonstrations. Tribal Museums Day honors diverse Native nations as the experts of their own cultures. You can find a map of tribal museums and more at indian-affairs.org/Tribal Museums Day. The association supports this show.
Thank you for listening to Native America Calling. Let's continue our conversation about the annual United Nations Climate Conference referred to as COP30. We're gaining insights from climate advocates from the United States and Brazil on decisions being made there. And you can join us with a comment or a question. Just call 1-800-996-2848. Or you can also leave a comment on our social media pages, Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, Threads. Pick any one of those platforms, and please engage with us here at Native America Calling. Joining us next is Edson Krenak. He is the Brazil Program Manager for Cultural Survival. He is Krenak, an Indigenous people in Brazil. Edson, you've been on the show before. Welcome back. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me back. Hello, everyone. Here, Burum. I greet all my relatives listening to us, and also my two sisters here, Tylee and Andrea. Thank you.
Well, thank you for introducing Tylee Edson. She also joins us, Tylee Terena. She is an Indigenous climate and land activist and International Indian Treaty Council delegate. She is Terena, another Indigenous people in Brazil. Tylee, great to have you on the show today, and welcome.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for receiving me today. I'm speaking directly from the venues of COP30. Excited to share with our listeners about how things are going and happening here.
Great to have you, Tylee. And also joining us today is Thomas Joseph. He is the carbon pricing educator for the Indigenous Environmental Network. He is Hupa, Karuk, and Paiute Shoshone. Joseph, hello. Welcome to our show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And I'd also like to give a shout out to KIDE Hoopa Valley radio station in Northern California.
All right. Thank you for that shout out, Thomas. And Edson, I want to begin with you. Let's talk about the location, Belém. It is on the edge of the Amazon rainforest. What's the significance of hosting the summit there?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, it is. It's a controversial significance. On one hand, we have many relatives here in the Amazon rainforest and rivers. Very happy to finally receive the world delegates, states in their home, in their traditional sacred lands, for them to share who they are, how they live, their food, their water, their music, their art, their needs, their priorities. But on the other hand, there is a huge frustration that these very people who live here hosting the COP also facing a systematic attack on their lands by illegal and also so-called legal state development projects, some of them related to the COP, like infrastructure for the COP, for transport, etc. Clear out sacred forests, contaminating even more the rivers, and to add to this list of frustration is the fact that the local populations and the indigenous peoples in the Amazon, they were not part of the designing, the planning, and the conversations about COP. COP is happening without full and proper free, prior, informed consent by the local indigenous peoples here and local traditional communities. In the Amazon forest is also home of Quilombola people, the Afro-descendants, enslaved population that were brought to Brazil centuries ago. They escaped, they formed their communities with the full support of indigenous peoples, because indigenous peoples in the Amazon, in the entire Brazil, and I believe in many parts of the world, we are very happy to host people, to receive. We practice gentle and radical hospitality. And besides the Quilombola, we also have several traditional communities here, communities from civil society, other groups that came into the forest to be embraced, to live among the forest, to learn the ways of the forest, the way of the rivers. Those communities, they are excluded from the decision-making processes from the beginning and now the end of this conference.
And I'm still curious to know, how are they being excluded? I mean, I would imagine there were probably years worth of preparations for this summit. I imagine people have been working on this for at least 2 or 3 years. Have there been any consultations at all with any of these indigenous groups, or was there any going into this? Did they realize that, hey, they're not going to be included? They're not going to be, their voices will not be heard. Did they know that ahead of time?
Well, the thing is, states, they have a bad habit of mistaking consultation with consentment. They also mistake consultation with information. And then they create these panels, these public gatherings to inform the population, to inform people, society, cities, communities that they are going to do this and that without really hearing and listening to these communities. Since the very beginning, when COP was decided to be here in the Amazon, indigenous peoples, friends and relatives of us, like Munduruku people, Arapiun, and Tupiniquins, they warned the government, they informed the government, all other authorities that there is a huge risk. They informed about the impact of such event in the Amazon in terms of forest, river, and infrastructure that would need to be to hold and to handle this event here. They didn't oppose, but they warned that this plan should be held with association, with full participation of those communities and their organizations that are fully prepared to talk, to decide, to guide the government to respect the land where they are right now. The problem, my friend, is the COP, this conference is also a space of a huge, powerful lobbying. And then we are having the second largest delegation of this COP. It belongs to the oil, gas, and mining lobby institute organizations. They come here to drive, to shape, and to influence the climate agenda. Why are they doing that? Of course, because of their money. They have money, they have economic power. They exclude communities, indigenous peoples, and traditional communities. And the problem, you said how they did that. They did since the very beginning, when the organizations and institutions hired to organize the COP, to be able to prepare the venue, the facilities, everything that is needed. The Brazilian government hired organizations that are outside of the rainforest. From the south of Brazil, from the industrialized cities, states, and even foreign organizations. Okay. Then the local people had very few or little to say in the very beginning. We don't want it to be informed only. We don't want it to be consulted when the decisions are already made and taken. We want it to be part of the very beginning, the decision-making process.
Edson, thank you. And it really makes a person wonder. You mentioned this large number of lobbyists for oil, gas, and coal interests. They outnumbered delegates at the conference. Really makes you wonder how much influence some of these people have with regard to how some of these industries and some of these policies are actually going to be determined. So Edson Kernack joining us here on Native America Calling today. The phone number for other listeners who would like to join our conversation, 1-800-99-NATIVE. Give us a call. Let us know what you think. And let's bring Tylee Terena into our conversation now. She is also at COP30. And Tylee, I want to ask you more about the indigenous protesters who are sending the message that their voices are not being heard. Do you think that message and these concerns are getting through at all to any of these delegates and organizers at the summit?
Yes. So the indigenous protest that happened last week, it was a lot reflected with what Edson said about engaging the participation of the indigenous from this region here. They are all from the Pará state where it's happening COP. So Belém is the capital of Pará. And unfortunately, even though that the COP presidency did a lot of propaganda saying that this would be the indigenous COP, that this is, and I'm quoting, like the biggest and the best participation of indigenous peoples is not the reality that we are seeing. And also because here in the COP venue, there's a lot of false solutions being sold on behalf of indigenous peoples. So these nations that came to protest, we have in different days, they all come from the same region, the Tapajós River. And the Tapajós River is facing a lot of issues with illegal gold mining. Most of these nations that live from these rivers, they are all contaminated by mercury, the deforestation of the lands. And yeah, they didn't have the opportunity. They were not even invited to be here and speak on what is happening. And
Okay.
now Brazil is selling some false solutions here that it will affect their territory as well. And we are not having a space a seat in the decision making process.
Okay.
So this protest, sorry.
I'm sorry, Tylee. I want to, we're limited on time, and I do want to ask you about one development that does sound positive, and it's the announcement that Brazil will designate cultural and environmental legal protections for 10 new indigenous territories. Sounds like good news, is it?
Oh, yeah. Well, of course, it's good news, but we also have to be like a critical view on the timing that this is happening, right? Because Brazil like has a lot of indigenous lands that are waiting for the demarcation. And here in Brazil, we have like the demarcation of the land is not only like, okay, they demarcated, there is a lot of process. And those 10 indigenous lands that they announced is only like it's starting the process of the demarcation of the lands. So it's not yet demarcated. And yesterday, because like there was a lot of noise about this news because the presidency was announcing as like they were already conclude, like the demarcation was already conclude. They released the demarcations of more four indigenous lands. And unfortunately, for example, we had more than 60 indigenous lands that are only waiting for the president to sign, and some of these lands are waiting for more than 30 years. Why now? Why not when Lula assumed the presidency? Why in another moment? Why it needs to be like during the COP30 so they can sell the image as a good country that is friend with indigenous peoples? So yeah, I have a lot of criticisms about it. Of course, I'm happy and I cheer with my relatives. But this is just like one small step that the government should do, and they could demarcate much more lands and use this moment to demarcate all these lands that are waiting for so many years, and they are not doing anything. And also
Okay.
important to say that the demarcation of the land here in Brazil doesn't guarantee the protection of the people, the protection of the land, and also that is the land is healthy. Like some of these lands are already deforested, the soil is already contaminated. So it's kind of like it's good, but there is also a critical view from my perspective.
Okay, thank you, Tylee. I want to bring Thomas Joseph into our conversation here in just a moment, but first, I would like Edson Krenak to chime in as well with regard to this demarcation issue. Edson, what are your thoughts?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I agree with Tylee. Demarcation of lands in Brazil is at the same time the indigenous solution for the climate crisis we are facing, because in demarcated land is protected land, but it is not enough. We still have Brazil is one of the most dangerous countries in the world for indigenous peoples, the environment defenders. We're still keeping more than 100 indigenous peoples killed per year, even during this government, for defending their lands. And the killers are associated with mining, agro-business, real estate investment, and other sectors of the Brazilian society. And they don't respect even age. We have this year as young as 14 years old and elderly people being killed because they are defending their lands. And most of them, they are not even defend lands that are not demarcated. They are defending lands that are already demarcated. Then Brazil is falling short, is failing in not only demarcate the lands, but also provide protection to the demarcated lands already.
All right, Edson, thank you. Tylee, I want to go back to you. And Edson just touched on the fact that Brazil, this is a place that has a very sordid reputation with regard to the physical safety of indigenous activists and indigenous leaders. In fact, just recently, an indigenous leader in Brazil was killed after a deadly attack. What do you want people to know in addition to what we've heard from Edson about the threat to indigenous people there?
Yes, I want to mention to everyone that I don't know if people are familiar, but Brazil, it's always in the top 5, and this is not the best position that we should be of research from Global Witness to be one of the most dangerous places in the world to be indigenous, like right defender and environmentalist defender. Because we kill a lot of our own people. So recently we had a conflict in the state that my people comes from, in Mato Grosso do Sul, where there is a lot of this conflict with agribusiness industry that took our traditional land. And the Guarani Kaiowá is the most affected one, with the most atrocities, like for people being burned alive, people being decapitated. And this weekend, it was an attack happening there in one of these land back movements camps that they have. And one person was killed with the shot in his neck, and other 4 was really injured by the bullets. And no one speaks about them. And because we are not in the Amazon, we are more in the center south of the country, and agribusiness lobbies are so strong in the media, in the news here, and even the corridors of COP30. People doesn't know about it. So this is not an isolated case. It's not only about the Guarani Kaiowá, but the Guarani Kaiowá is the ones that are face this violence more frequently. So every week we have these attacks happening
Shiley,
there.
I'm sorry, we have to take another break, but we're going to come back. We'll continue this conversation.
Support from Clarkson Potter, publisher of Turtle Island, Foods and Traditions of the Indigenous Peoples of North America by Native American chef Sean Sherman. With ancestral and modern recipes, this cookbook showcases diverse foodways of the continent's regions.
Need help identifying community priorities? Kaufman & Associates' approach to evaluation is rooted in Indigenous knowledge, honoring tribal history, and sovereignty. More at kaufmaninc.com, KAUFFMANINC.com.
You're listening to Native America Calling. We're discussing the indigenous perspective of COP30 and climate change. Feel free to weigh in. Call us at 1-800-996-2848. Let's now speak with Thomas Joseph. He is the carbon pricing educator for the Indigenous Environmental Network. And Thomas, you and others in your organization spoke on panels at COP30. What have you conveyed to attendees?
And so IEN is here in a few different capacities. During the COP30, there's also been what we call the People Summit, which is a large conglomerate of how civil society is trying to raise their voices and their concerns addressing the climate change policy that's being created inside the convention of parties that Andrea is talking about, the COP30. There's also was the Mar and Contra, which was a group of the largest civil society movement from people affected by dams. And as a tribal member of the Hoopa Valley tribe, we also have successfully fought for the removal of 4 dams along our Klamath River. In this space, we've also had attendance from the Yakama Nation of Kia Wiki and Brooke Thompson that are also active inside the COP space. And so as we've been sitting on panels here, we've been trying to raise our concerns on how Indigenous people's rights need to be upheld to the most highest extent level. We have the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which confirms that the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples must be granted in order for any further exploitation of their land can be occurred. But this needs to be the bottom level, and parties or nations that wish to participate in this Paris Climate Agreement treaty seem to think that that's the floor, seem to think that if they can check that box, that is good. But we need to make sure that as we move forward, just like Andrea Carmen stated, we're not reduplicating the errors of the past. If we're going to move forward with electrification of cars, we can't just start strip mining lithium, especially on sacred sites, without the free, prior, and informed consent of those Indigenous peoples, as we see in northern Nevada. We see the massive mining expansion also in Canada, where they're not even following their Environmental Protection Agency with the copper expansion mining in British Columbia, or the expansion of the coal mine also in British Columbia. Canada holds a lot of weight here. They try to look like they're the friends of the Indigenous people, but yet 70% of the international mining operations globally are by them, most of it infringing upon the rights of Indigenous peoples. And so, as we're here, it always feels like it's a harm reduction campaign. What can we move forward? What can we do to make these countries harm us the least? The United Nations has a direct uh, desire to continue to access unceded indigenous territories, and so a lot of these carbon market solutions and these carbon the solutions that they're asking for climate change are based in market mechanisms that are just granting them access to unceded indigenous lands through monetary gain, through profit. And we want to say that can't be done. We need real solutions to move forward. We need to be able to find mechanisms to keep fossil fuels in the ground, as it's the primary root cause of climate change.
Well, let's talk more about real solutions, Thomas, because your title, Carbon Pricing Educator. I'm interested in learning more about your role and the future of UN-backed carbon offset credits.
Well, what we see here is they're putting the price tag on our Mother Earth. They're selling and trading carbon as a to be sold and bought on an open market. And the sequestration of carbon is something that happens naturally. A tree is not going to sequester more carbon just because you're giving money to indigenous people. It's going to sequestrate the same amount. And so what we're saying is what we're doing here is following the Article 6 of the Paris Climate Agreement, which pertains to carbon markets, and gathering that information and reiterating it back to tribal communities at home. Because carbon markets is a scheme, it's a scam, it's not a solution to climate change. We can't buy our way out of this climate crisis. We need real solutions, and real solutions are rooted in indigenous communities, pertaining to the traditional knowledge that we have to learn how to be in relationship with place.
Okay. I'm just confused, Thomas, because this all sounds great. It really does. And these are the types of words and the types of positions that really fire up our listeners here on Native America Calling, many Indigenous people concerned about these issues, just like you are. But again, hearing just how this conference is set up and all of the lobbying interests with fossil fuel and energy companies, how do you make this happen? How do you get consensus that these indigenous practices are so valuable and they offer the solutions when it doesn't sound like anybody really wants to hear it?
That's a tricky question. It was raised earlier by Edson. The fossil fuel industry lobbyists outnumber the largest contingency here, which is the indigenous peoples. Out of every 25 participants of COP this year, one is paid by the fossil fuel lobbyists. And so if they are here actually writing climate policy, how are we supposed to have faith in the system to address climate change at source?
Exactly.
Coming from the belly of the beast, California, the fourth largest economy in the world, inside of the United States, we are one of the biggest consumers. We should hold the greatest responsibility to address climate change. But yet our solutions are rooted in market mechanisms. We can't continue to commodify our Mother Earth and expect us to be able to pay our way out of this climate crisis. You look at the elites and what they're doing towards the climate crisis. They're preparing bunkers. They're preparing all this craziness. And indigenous peoples that are on the ground will be the first ones affected by climate change. Even this year, Alaska got hit by a typhoon, and hundreds of people had to evacuate their villages, maybe never to return. Indigenous people of the United States are already becoming climate refugees. We need to be able to make sure that the indigenous voice inside these COP spaces are heard, and to see that this is always going to be a party-driven, meaning a nation-driven process, really is not going to be able to create that type of space. And so that's why there's other spaces that are being created, like the People's Summit, like the Mar and Contra. As the indigenous people banged on the doors of the United Nations to demand that their voices are heard here in COP, they were met by brutal force of the Brazilian military. This place has been highly militarized. It's crazy walking into COP and you're passing just tons of military police all the way in, and they harass you. They want to check your bags. They want to make sure you're badged. They're not doing that to everybody, but they're definitely doing it to the Indigenous people. And if they can brutally harm them in front of the globe on a global stage, imagine what they're doing to them in the forests. We know what they're doing to them. We know why murdering and missing Indigenous women are the number one, is a major issue in our communities back in the States. Indigenous women are our greatest, our land defenders. They're our greatest teachers. And so, of course, they'd be the biggest target. Of course, the industry that has a desire to rape and destroy the land for profit and for gain and for power are going to target the people that are our greatest warriors, that are our greatest defenders, and that's Indigenous women.
Thomas, I want to thank you and all of the other guests who joined us from Brazil today to update us on COP30. Really appreciate your time. I want to bring in one more guest who joins us from Treaty 6 territory in Alberta, Canada. Brandy Morin. She is a freelance reporter. She is Cree, Iroquois, and French. Brandy, it's great to have you back on NAC. How you doing?
Fancy. I'm good. How are you? Thank you for having me.
I'm doing really well. Thank you for asking. Now, you are in Canada, and you wrote a series of reports that originate in Ecuador. What's the connection, Brandy?
Yeah, so I've been going down back and forth to Ecuador for about a year now. I was doing some feature reporting into mining operations that are affecting Indigenous communities that have not given their free, prior, and informed consent, and also visiting communities in the jungle that have managed to successfully keep industry out of their territories.
This sounds like a really interesting series of reports, and you spending time in these communities. Tell me more about that process of making those connections and what it took to gain the trust of these people.
Yeah, so I have been making a documentary now for a little while about the extractive industry and its impacts globally on Indigenous peoples. And so Ecuador was on my list to go to, and I had been aware of one certain community that was being affected. It was a Canadian mine at the time. It's no longer Canadian owned. And Amnesty International had connected me with the community, and I had some Zoom meetings with them with an interpreter because, of course, they speak Spanish, and then decided to go down and visit them. They're deep into the in the jungle. They're a Shuar community, and the Shuar are famous for being the only nation that was never conquered by the Spanish, and also who used to shrink the heads of their enemies. So I arranged to go down there with a team and do some filming and do some reporting with Cultural Survival and an outlet called Ricochet. And like I said, we had a couple of Zoom meetings. There was that relationship already established with Amnesty International. So went down there and went, and seen their home in the jungle, and just was absolutely captivated by the beauty of it, with the culture that is still intact. They only had a road to their community put in 10 years ago. Before that, it was a 2-day trek into the jungle. They only got Wi-Fi a year and a half ago. And so they live very close to the land and close to the culture. And so I learned about the struggle that they're facing, with this invasion of this mine, not only the mine, the company, but backed by the state of Ecuador as they're readying to defend their territories.
Well, tell us more about this Canadian mining company and what concerns you most about this project that they're working on in Ecuador.
Yeah, so like I said, it was formerly Canadian owned. Earlier this year, they left Canada because they were soliciting Chinese investment, and Canada has a ban on any Chinese investment here in industry. And so they pulled out of Canada and they moved their head offices back to Quito in Ecuador. And they've been working under different company names trying to get this mine off the ground for about 20 years now. And they've been in the exploratory phase for a couple of years now, and they've signed mutual benefit agreements with two other tribes that are close to the vicinity, but they have not signed an agreement, or this community that I went to did not give their free, prior, and informed consent to this mine. The community specifically was called Mequants, but yet their rights were not being respected, and the mine is still going through. And the industry in Ecuador has a reputation of being backed by the state and trampling over Indigenous rights, and the state bringing in the military to enforce, the will of the company. So I've gone to other communities in Ecuador, in the north where the Andes are, where there are some mixed Indigenous people that live there. That is a Canadian-owned mine. It's a Canadian-owned copper mine called Atico. A lot of violence has happened there. I met with a man who had his face and neck shot by the military as they were protesting, trying to defend their territories, and now, he's living with permanent, disabilities, and there's people that have constant threats of violence and death threats just for saying no to a project, just for wanting, their water to be clean and their lands to, not be at risk of getting poisoned. And I was just a couple of months ago in a different area of Ecuador, again, another Canadian-owned mine. And, it's another thing to study about it and research about how these mines are operating around the world, right? Because we have these countries like Canada, which is one of the biggest mining countries in the world, that operates around the world, that's not regulated very well, and what they're getting away with due to these lack of regulations, you read about it, you research, but it's something else to see it in real life. And when I went to this other recent one in a community called Las Navas, again, another copper development, but the mine had hired private security who were heavily armed.
Okay.
Okay.
Brandy, I'm sorry. I want to ask you one more question. We have time because you wrote a story recently for Manga Bay, and it's a profile about Indigenous women patrolling and protecting the rainforest from these mining and logging activities that you're talking about today. How effective are these efforts?
Yeah, so this is, a very successful story of a community called Pacayacu. They're Quechua, and they are deep in the jungle. They're only accessible by a boat. It's about a 2-hour boat ride from the nearest port. And they have, managed to keep out industry, up until now in their territories. And they have a guardianship program, so land guardians or defenders, and they're men and women, but they have a team of women specifically that are trained, and they patrol the territory, and they walk around with spears that are carved from the palm trees there that grow in their territory, and they patrol and monitor the boundaries of their lands to make sure that outsiders don't come in, or, people that are scouting out, the land or our industry. And I've spoken with, members of the Guard and these warriors where there has been times when people have been caught in their territory that did not have permission to be there, and they are captured and they are held in their territory until they sign agreements with them that they will respect their sovereignty and that they won't come back. And these women are they're really powerful, and they're young. They're of all ages, actually, but it's something that their ancestors did. And so, it's kind of in their bloodline to do and to protect. And it's really powerful to see in person.
All right. Thank you, Brandy. And for listeners who are interested in learning more, we do have links to Brandy's reporting on our website. Check it out, nativeamericacalling.com. We have now reached the end of our hour, so I want to thank our guests who joined us today, Brandy Morin, Thomas Joseph, Edson Krenak, Tylee Terena, and Andrea Carmen. Join us again tomorrow. We'll take a look at 2 places where the country's crackdown on immigration intersects with Native Americans. I'm Sean Spruce. Hope you'll tune in.
Every family caregiver could use help finding the necessary resources to care for their loved one. The AARP Family Caregiver Resource Guide helps family caregivers access key programs, services, and agencies in their communities. A copy of the guide is available by calling 877-333-5885 or online at aarp.org/caregiverresources. AARP supports this show.
Early detection helps save lives. Talk with your Indian healthcare provider to learn which breast cancer screening options are right for you. For more information, visit healthcare.gov/coverage or call 1-800-318-2596. A message from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services.
Native America Calling is produced in the Annenberg National Native Voice Studios in Albuquerque, New Mexico by Koahnic Broadcast Corporation, a Native nonprofit media organization. Funding is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting with support from the Public Radio Satellite Service. Music is by Brent Michael Davids. Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.